Although I'm constantly playing games and have been for several decades now, like everybody, I still have a few holes in my video game knowledge. One of them involves European computers from the 1980s and 90s. While I was playing the Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega Genesis, millions of gamers across the pond were enjoying the ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC, platforms that I have almost no experience with. That's why I was so excited to dive into the Retro Golden Age series from Zerouno Games. This is a cool new line of games that celebrate some of the great Spanish developers working on the Amstrad CPC, including titles as diverse as the burglary simulator Goody, run-and-gun shooter Operation Alexandra, and the adventure/platformer Livingstone, I presume. With each new game sold separately, I decided that it would be a good idea to review each game one at a time. That said, there are a few features and options that carry over between the three entries in the Retro Golden Age lineup. For starters, all three of the games now allow you to save at any time, as well as rewind time in order to fix some of your past mistakes. You also have a number of video options, including making the screen full size and adding filters to make it look even more authentic to the 1980s. Unfortunately, the one thing the games don't come with is any real information about the titles. As somebody who's never played these three games before and has no experience at all with the Amstrad CPC, it sure would have been nice to get some sort of history lesson, even if it's just a paragraph or two giving the game and platform some context. That complaint aside, these Retro Golden Age releases have a lot going for them. Here are my thoughts on all three of the classic games. The first Retro Golden Age release that I played was Goody, and to say that I had a negative first reaction would be a real understatement. When I first loaded up this game about a burglar, I was immediately struck by how poorly it controlled, how easy it was to die, and just how completely out of my depth I felt. I worried that this was going to be my reaction to all three of these games, potentially pissing off a lot of European gamers. With that weight on my shoulder, I pushed on. And you know what? I'm glad I did, because I learned some valuable lessons about what I should expect from all three of these Amstrad CPC titles. I had to throw out a lot of preconceived notions about what a side-scrolling platformer should be and just meet the game where it was. And while I'm not sure that I would recommend this to people who don't have nostalgia for Goody, I am glad that I started here. Put simply, you play Juan Nelson Brainer Stravinsky, a former upper-crust gentleman who loses it all and turns to a life of crime. This is a comical adventure that sees him running, jumping, and avoiding the fuzz as he tries to pull off his latest get-rich-quick scheme: a bank robbery. Of course, it's not going to be that easy, as everything, including the moon, is trying to stop you. The first thing you're going to notice about Goody is that it doesn't simply come with 1 or 2 lives, but rather 15. That's right, we start the game with 15 lives. And let me tell you, you're gonna need them. This is one of those games where everything can and will kill you. It's common to die 4 or 5 times simply because there's a snake sitting on the respawn point. And it certainly doesn't help that the weapon that you throw barely gets the job done, since it never seems to go in the direction that you want. It all adds up to a challenging platformer where you'll die over and over and over until you get it right. It's sad, the more that I played Goody, the more that I enjoyed what it was trying to do. I appreciated that we weren't just going through a bunch of levels, but rather interacting with a good-sized open world with interconnected paths. I liked that we could find and use burglary tools to get around the map in different ways, such as a ladder and bolt cutters. I also liked that you had to find out a lot of this on your own, with almost no hand-holding through what turns out to be a surprisingly complicated game. This is a game that expects you to poke at it and learn from your deaths until you find the right path and items that you'll need to pull off the heist. And that ended up being a pretty satisfying experience when all was said and done. Unfortunately, the frustrating gameplay and cheap deaths make it hard for me to recommend Goody to anybody who doesn't already have nostalgia for this 35-year-old action game. Of the 3 Retro Golden Age releases, this is by far my least favorite. Originally released back in 1986, Livingstone, I presume, is the oldest game featured in the retro Golden Age series. But don't take that to mean that it's the most archaic, because this side-scrolling adventure game has a surprising amount of depth and sophistication for its time. At first glance, Livingstone, I presume, looks a lot like an unofficial sequel to Pitfall. I get that, but don't let the first appearances fool you, because there's a lot more going on here than in Activision's 8-bit classic. For starters, you play New York Herald journalist Henry Morton Stanley, the man tasked with surviving the dangers of Africa in an effort to track down the famous English missionary David Livingstone. This is, of course, based on real events, and there's no question that Stanley's adventure through Africa is a compelling starting point for a side-scrolling adventure game. Now, one thing that I really like about Livingstone, I presume, is that it gives you the weapons and items right up front. From the very start, we're able to cycle through 4 different accessories, each with their own purpose. There's the pole vault that will allow you to make impossible jumps, as well as knives, bombs, and even a boomerang that will make it a lot easier to overcome the continent's many obstacles and enemies. As you might expect, you get the usual batch of baddies, ranging from members of the animal kingdom to man-eating plants. And speaking of enemies that love the taste of human flesh, you'll also have to deal with cannibalistic tribes, complete with questionable racial stereotyping. And when you're not running and pole vaulting from danger, you'll spend most of the time just trying to get the platforming right. Much like Goody, Livingstone, I presume, takes place in one large interconnected world. A lot of the game comes down to figuring out the right path and memorizing the enemy patterns. Once you have those down, you can beat the game in around 10 minutes. Still, you're going to see a lot in that 10 minutes, and finding the right path is going to take a lot of failed attempts. While I kind of hate the pole vaulting mechanic, I can appreciate that this game is at least trying something different. I also really like that we're given all the weapons and items right up front, allowing us to just jump into the action. Some of the elements have not aged particularly well, but even as somebody who has no nostalgia for this game, I had no problem getting into the adventure. I give it a tepid recommendation. Operation Alexandra is easily my favorite of the retro Golden Age releases, and is the only one that I would wholeheartedly recommend. It is also the newest, originally released as a homebrew CPC game from developer 4MHz back in 2018. If you ever wanted to accuse me of falling prey to recency bias, well, here's your opportunity. Set in the mid-1970s, you play a Soviet soldier who unearths an old World War II-era Nazi base in the Arctic Circle. What he finds there is both alarming and deadly, leading to an action-packed side-scrolling run-and-gun shooter with a cool sci-fi story and great throwback graphics. Now, I call it a run-and-gun shooter, but this is not Contra. In a lot of ways, Operation Alexandra shares more in common with something like a Metroidvania game. You explore a modestly sized open world, picking up items and using them to open up new sections of the Nazi base. For example, early on you're going to need to find a gas tank in order to power the compound and open up the nearby door. This will force you to explore every part of the base for useful items and power-ups. Now, much like the other games in the retro Golden Age line, Operation Alexandra isn't a long game. If you know what you're doing, you can beat this game in less than 20 minutes. Maybe even a fraction of that. Of course, you have to know what you're doing, and that's going to require a lot of trial and error. Between exploring the base, solving the puzzles, and learning how to take out all the different types of enemies, you're going to be at this game for a few hours. Now, I think it's fair to say that developer 4MHz learned the lessons from the games of the past. Operation Alexandra keeps the interconnected world in high difficulty, but gets rid of the cheap deaths and frustrating gameplay. Yeah, it still feels like it came out in the 1980s, but it never felt like I was actively fighting the control. It also looks phenomenal, with all kinds of small details and a genuinely eerie atmosphere. Look, while I'm sure that there are some lifelong Amstrad fans that'll think that it's blasphemy to recommend the 2018 homebrew game over 2 genuine classics from the 1980s, well, that's exactly what I'm gonna do. With great gameplay, an engaging story, and a genuinely cool Nazi base to explore, Operation Alexandra is the best thing to come out of the retro Golden Age lineup of games. Hey, thanks for watching us review these classic Amstrad games. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post new reviews and features almost every day. Now, here's the question I have for you. What is your favorite video game knowledge hole? Like I said, I'm not that well versed when it comes to European computer games. But what about you? Did you miss out on the arcade scene? Maybe a particular console? Maybe even a huge franchise or genre? Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with an April Fool's Day celebration featuring Nintendo Power. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then,